Hi, welcome. I'm Mark Thorsby, and this is an introduction to the history of ancient philosophy. Welcome, and I hope you're doing well. Welcome to our course. Um, what I want to talk about in this video here, this is a shorter video than many of the other ones in the playlist, is I wanted to start off by talking about some of the basics about ancient Greek philosophy. And again, I'm going to be using this book here, which is Ancient Greek Philosophy Readings from Thales to Aristotle. Um, but I'll be giving you the citation numbers of all of the people I quote in either the Stephanus, the Becker, or the DK numbering system, which is the universal numbers that most scholarly editions use for any of these texts. So if you have your own book, you can just follow along. What I want to start off with here is who are we going to be looking at this semester? Who are the philosophers on our docket, as it were? You can see here, I love this painting. I'm sure you've seen it. This is the School of Athens by Raphael. And it depicts all of the famous philosophers from ancient Greek philosophy. Of course, most of these people never met each other. Many of them did, but certainly not all of them. Famously, at the very center here is Plato, and then this is supposed to be Aristotle. Socrates is sort of hanging out right here. And there's a whole number of other philosophers. One of the things that's sort of interesting and fun to do is to try to figure out who each of these philosophers are. There's plenty of stuff online. Take a look at it. Famous and a very beautiful painting regarding ancient Greek philosophy. But who are we going to be looking at this semester in these series of videos on the history of ancient philosophy? Well, some of them we're going to be reading. Some of them we're just going to be reading about. Like, for instance, Thales. We don't have really any of his original writings. We just have commentary about him. So we'll be looking at Thales. We'll be looking at Anaximander, Anaximenes, Pythagoras, Xenophanes, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno of Elea. There's a whole bunch of different Zenos. We'll also look at Zeno of Citium later. Leucippus, Democritus. We'll look at a whole range of sophists. I didn't put all their names down because I didn't have enough space. But Gorgias, Protagoras are some of the sophists we'll look at. Of course, the bulk of our energy is actually going to be dedicated to these two guys right here, Plato and Aristotle. There are the heavyweights of ancient Greek philosophy by far. Of course, I didn't put on the list here Socrates. We'll, of course, be reading Plato's dialogues about Socrates, or dialogues in which he presents or represents Socrates. So Socrates should be on the list here. After all, we're going to see we're dividing our terms here in terms of thinking about the pre-Socratic philosophers, Socrates. But all of Socrates had no writing, so everything about Socrates comes from our Plato's on dialogue. Of course, there are three sources for Socrates. There are two sources outside of Plato, but Plato's the primary focus. And then we'll be looking at Aristotle. And then at the end here, we're going to be looking at some later Hellenistic philosophy. We'll be looking at Epicurus, Epictetus, and we will actually take a look at Pyrrhonian skepticism, and we'll be looking at with Sextus Empiricus. So we're going to look at a couple other people besides this list, but for the most part, the key philosophers we're looking at in this course are going to be Plato and Aristotle and the Pre-Socratic philosophers, which is this whole pool of people right here. Pardon me. Minimize that. So this is who we're going to be looking at. And who are these philosophers? Now, I should say is that these philosophers are going to present us with each one of them with really some powerful, provocative questions. They're also going to provide some answers, or at least they're going to pose some answers, rather. But we'll see, and we will be skeptical about whether or not those answers are ultimately sufficient or not. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at this semester. Now, what I want to do is I want to focus on this. What I want to argue is what's important about ancient Greek philosophy. Why are we starting there? And by the way, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, if you're watching this, of course, we could talk about ancient Asian philosophy, Eastern philosophy. There's lots of other ancient philosophers out there who really provide some provocative ideas that are worth thinking about. But this course, we're really just looking at the history of Occidental philosophy in terms of the Greek world. What I think you see with these ancient Greek philosophers, beginning with Thales and stretching out into the Roman world past Aristotle and into the skeptics and the Stoic philosophers, is you see a marked transition from mythos to logos, from mythos to logos. Now, these are transliterations of two important Greek terms: mythos, which is where we get our sense of mythology from, and logos, which is where we get our sense of logic from. And of course, in ancient Greek, these things meant slightly different things. Mythos refers to a story, and logos refers to dialogue. We're going to see that dialogue, and what Plato will later call the dialectic, is really a pivotal piece to the activity of philosophy. But what we see is a transition here from narrative mythology into, from narrative mythology, from social dogmatics, from religious explanations. We see a transition towards the idea of giving evidence and argumentation, towards naturalistic explanations. And we also see the rise in these ancient Greek philosophers, especially the Pre-Socratics, the rise of what I would refer to as a skeptical rational attitude. So none of these Pre-Socratic philosophers think, for instance, that you should just believe what they have to say because they're smart. They argue that you have to listen to the argumentation. For instance, Heraclitus, a well-known ancient Greek philosopher that we're going to look at, he says, listen to my report, right? Listen to what I'm arguing. Don't listen to me, right? And you're going to see what we see in the ancient Greek world is suddenly a move away from accepting things because they're religiously and socially the norm to believe, right? Towards the idea that we should rationally evaluate things, and that we as human beings can actually understand the world, and we should demand that our understanding be one that's logical and one that can be explained. And so we see this sort of transition from mythos to logos in the ancient Greek world. And in this video, all I really want to do is give you some of the basics of where this very beginning point begins. We'll talk about this quite a bit throughout the semester. One of the things I should say is a brief word on pagination, in terms of, and I mentioned this at the very beginning of the video, in terms of how things are. So in this book, you'll see, of course, there's regular page numbers. Sometimes I'll refer to those as the book page numbers. But each one of our thinkers has official pagination that we're going to be referring to. So whenever you make a citation, whether in a post, or if you're just discussing it, or if you are writing this in your paper, or however you want to do it, I want you to use the scholarly norm. And the scholarly norm is to cite them in the universal pagination that we typically abide by. So if we're looking at a pre-Socratic philosopher, we use what are called the Dielskrantz numbering system. And this comes from basically a huge collection of all of these texts in ancient Greek by two German editors. And the name of this collection was Die Fragmente der Vorsokratiker, the fragments of the Pre-Socratics. And this was actually published in 1908. You can actually download the whole thing if you read ancient Greek. You can download the whole thing for free from Google Books. I doubt you read ancient Greek, so I won't really worry about it. But what we do is when they published that version, they had page numbers, and we're using their page numbering system. And pretty much everyone across the board, most scholars around the entire world, use this pre-Socratic pagination system. And the reason that's important is because if you go and you start reading journal articles, or you read other text and they refer to a quote, look for the DK number, because that'll allow you to actually find it in your book or allow you to find it elsewhere. So you're not tied to just one edition of this book. For the Platonic dialogue, so all of Plato's writings, we're going to be using what are known as the Stephanus numbers. And that's from a translation by Stephanus in the 1578. Well, it wasn't a translation, it was originally the original Greek. and he published an edition of it in 1578. And really, since the Renaissance, we've been using the Stephanus pagination numbers. You'll see that the Stephanus pagination numbers, just to sort of throw it out here. Let's see here. So, for instance, here it's hard to see, but here's Protagoras. The pagination is located on the side, right? And it's usually so you'll have, like, for instance, you'll have page 361, B, C, D, E, and then it'll go to 362 and so forth. So when you quote something, for instance, here I would just, if I was going to give this quote, it'd be here's the words. I have no other reason for asking things than my desire to answer these questions about virtue, especially what virtue is in itself. This is from the Protagoras, and it's Plato's writings 360 E12 to 361 A1. So that's how we're going to use those paginations. That's how we're going to, make citations to the Platonic dialogues throughout this course, and you should get used to it. And then for Aristotle's text, or the Aristotelian treatise, we use what are called the Becker numbers, and they essentially function just the same. And that edition was published in 1831. This is a history of ancient philosophy, and it's important for you to know some of the scholarly, the basic scholarly elements and practices here as you begin to explore this work in more depth. Now, I'm just saying this. I have a little tile here, a little slide called the where and the when, and that is where are these philosophers coming from, and when did they live? And for that, I'm going to actually jump over here. For those of you who, let's see, oh, something went wrong here. Hold on. Let me pause. What I want to do is show you your textbook, the textbook I'll be using. But somehow it's not on there. So give me just 1 second, let me load it. Okay, thank you for that brief pause there. So this is the textbook we'll be using in this video. Readings in Ancient Greek Philosophy from Thales Aristotle. Again, there's lots of different editions of this stuff, but we're using this edition, which was edited by Mark Cohen, Patricia Curd, and then CDC Reed. This is published by Hackett Publishing. I encourage you to take a look at it. What I'm showing you right now comes from their online reader, so if you want to get access to it for an inexpensive price, you can just purchase this directly from Hackett, and you can read it online, or you're on your Kindle, your iPad, whatever, and it'll even read it to you if you want. So, but what I want to sort of take you through here is just, we're looking at the 4th edition here, and I'm not going to be reading much through. I just wanted to point your attention here to the maps. Let me move this over briefly. Oops. So here we go. Let me go to maps. Let's see. Is there a way? Uh-oh. I just realized that the map is sideways. Okay, hold on a minute. Hold on a moment. So we're back, and I appreciate your patience there. What I wanted to do is I wanted to show you from the textbook, because there's a series of maps in a timeline that I wanted to draw your attention to, but since I couldn't rotate the image, it wasn't going to be very helpful. So what I've done here is I've just pulled out the same images, or very similar images, on Google Maps here, which I can sort of show you. So where did all these philosophers live that we're going to be looking at? For the most part, they live in the Mediterranean world, primarily in Greece. Now, of course, we're going to see that the big philosophers we're going to take a look at here are going to be Aristotle and Plato, and those philosophers lived in Athens in particular. But we're going to see that ancient Greek philosophy doesn't actually begin in Athens. It actually begins over here on the coast of what is today Eastern Turkey. And on this coastline, right here in the Ionian area, this is where Greek philosophy actually begins. And in just a couple minutes, I'll talk a little bit about more why that's really sort of important and interesting. You can also see that, just to point out some important places, here's Elea, which is off the coast of Italy. We've got Athens here, the famous city-state of Thebes, Delphi, which will come up when we hear about Socrates going to the Oracle of Delphi, Corinth. Many people have probably heard of Corinth from Corinthians in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. Oops, something popped up there. We've got Sparta, the ancient city-state and sort of enemy of Athens. Sometimes enemy, I should say, maybe a frenemy, as you might say. Stagria is located up here. And then you can see here's where ancient Troy is supposedly located. Let's see here. Important city-states over here on the east in Ionia. Ephesus, this is where Heraclitus lived. Miletus is where Thales lived, the very first philosopher. In fact, Miletus is where philosophy is to have been born originally. And so we'll talk about that and why it's interesting. The ancient Greek philosophy doesn't actually begin in Greece proper. It does begin in the Greek colonies at the time, and why that might be significant. So that's a little bit about what the what it looks like. Let me zoom this up here. Not the best image, but that's a little bit about where these philosophers are from. Now the question is when, and you can see here. I just pulled up this timeline. I apologize. There's a better one in the book, so I encourage you to take a look at that. There's also lots of this information online. You can easily find this. Go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, for instance. But you can see, really, we're talking in the 600s BCE is when philosophy, pre-Socratic philosophy, really begins. But you can see their lives actually overlapped quite a bit. This one doesn't a very good one because it just says the name, but their lives actually overlap quite a bit. Important for us, we'll see that the pre-Socratic philosophers were really pivotal in terms of getting these early questions in philosophy articulated, but we'll see that Socrates really transforms philosophy, and there's a reason that the pre-Socratic philosophers are called pre-Socratic. There's also a debate about whether or not and how far we should really, how seriously we should take that distinction. Part of the problem is that all of the philosophers before Socrates, we don't really have any of their works. What we have are fragments. And what those fragments are is primarily quotations by other philosophers. So we don't have, so they're not, the pre-Socratic philosophers, in all honesty, are not well represented in the modern tradition because most of the work, unfortunately, was destroyed through war and other reasons, unfortunately. Socrates never wrote anything, but we do know quite a bit about Socrates because we have many of Plato's and Aristotle's writings. We do have. Many of them were destroyed. So, for instance, we'll see that Plato, what we're going to be reading of Plato primarily comes in the form of dialogues. Plato also had non-dialogical writings, but very few of those survive. By contrast, Aristotle, who was Plato's student for almost 20 years, we don't have any of his dialogues, although he wrote them. Those were destroyed over time, but we do have what are considered his lecture notes or his students' lecture notes. But we do think that they do correspond to Aristotle's philosophical system. And we sort of, that's the mainstay scholarly perspective on it. There is, of course, always questions about the authenticity of these works. And there's scholars, the more you get into it, ancient scholars and classicists have lots of debates about this stuff. And it has lots to do with how you should translate this stuff and understand it and so forth. For instance, Plato, there's many works that we attribute to Plato that at different periods in history, scholars have disagreed about whether or not Plato actually wrote this dialogue or that dialogue. Today, for the most part, if you buy, for instance, the complete, let's see if I have it here, right here. This is a great book if you're interested in Plato. It's called Plato's Complete Works here. It's got some great translations. It's edited by Cooper. I'm not sure the publisher is off the top of my head. Let's see here, I'll tell you. It's published by Hackett, so it's also a Hackett text. It's a great source for Plato. But this, for instance, we include pretty much all the different works, including the ones with potentially false authorship. So we'll also be taking a look at Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. Epicurus lived just around the same time. We're not going to spend too much time on these philosophers, but we will read Epictetus. Now, Epictetus was not a Greek philosopher; he was a Roman philosopher. And same thing here with Sextus Empiricus. We'll also be taking a look at him. So this gives you sort of broad spectrum of what we're going to be looking at. Really, most of our work will focus on the 4th century BCE with Plato and Aristotle. But we will be sort of going between 600 BCE and around 200 AD. Okay, so that's a little bit about, let me go back here. That's a little bit about the who, and let me recenter this. That's a little bit about the who and the when of what we'll be taking a look at this course. Let me move forward here. Sorry about that. That was sort of a hang up there. Didn't work out quite as well as I was hoping. Let me start here. I'm gonna be posting other lectures that actually where we look in depth at some at these philosophers and the fragments we have of them. But I will sort of start off here with just a brief interlude saying that really Thales begins philosophy, at least Western philosophy, and typically the beginning date, if we're going to give a date, which I think is probably not wise, but if we're going to give a date so we can have something in the calendar here, we'll say that philosophy begins in 585 BCE. And it begins when Thales predicts the eclipse of the sun. Now, we're told in a story that Thales, this first philosopher, was able to predict an eclipse. We're able because of cosmology and because we can sort of figure out the pattern for the movement of the stars. We can actually calculate that this eclipse did happen in 585 BCE. And so that's usually the point because we know Thales must have been alive at that point. We don't really know much more about him personally. I mean, there's a number of different stories we'll take a look at. Um, but it is interesting here but it sort of begins at that point. Now, a question I want you to think about and that I want to ask here is, well, why should philosophy begin in this distant Greek colony of Miletus, right? This distant Greek colony of Miletus, which is, let's move it over here just a little bit, which is right here, right? Why is philosophy beginning there? Which is a really good question. And a lot of scholars have a lot of different theories. And in fact, this question has been, people have been talking about this question since Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle in the Metaphysics gives us a pretty good history of pre-Socratic philosophy. And he sort of talks about it. One of the things worth mentioning is that Aristotle talks about the idea that philosophy begins in leisure. It requires leisure, that you need time, you need space, and you need a certain amount of security and comfort to start doing philosophy. You know, philosophy doesn't happen on the trenches of wars, typically, because when people are not sure if they're going to live, they don't have time to reflect about life. They just have to live it. Um, and also, philosophy probably begins in these colonies, partially because of the Babylonian and Egyptian influence. The Egyptian influence is probably the strongest influence here, maybe more so than the Babylonian. Of course, that's obviously there are scholars greater than myself who would probably debate the point. But why is the Egyptian influence important? Well, we know that the Egyptians invented geometry. In fact, the word geometry is the combination of geometer. And literally, it comes from the Egyptian, which means geo means earth and meter means to measure. So literally, geometry means the measurement of the earth. And we know that the Egyptians had actually had fairly advanced geometric mathematics. And we believe that because of the close location of the Greek colonies to the Egyptian and Babylonian civilizations, we believe that, and these are also very cosmopolitan locations with lots of trade coming in. We believe that the philosophy may have been developed partially as a result of this influence from mathematics. After all, Pythagoras, we'll talk about later, he famous mathematician and philosopher, right? He certainly was influenced by the Egyptians. So we think that's part of it. Aristotle, well, let me put it this way. One of the things I think is important, my own personal, and I wouldn't put this on a test or anything, or I wouldn't write this in your paper, but I think there's something to the idea that they're also colonies, personally. So I would present the argument personally that Greek philosophy begins in the colonies partially because if you're living in a colony and you're creating a civilization from nothing, right, you have a whole bunch of cosmopolitan influences, but you also have to a society would have to develop a degree of self-sufficiency. You couldn't just expect things to be the way they were in Athens or Sparta, right? If you're a member of a colony, you have to be self-sufficient. You have to grow your own crops. You have to make your own buildings, right? You have to do all of this stuff. There's less people to do it. And so I think you probably develop a higher degree of autonomy in which people think for themselves because they have to practically solve more problems than they probably would have otherwise. It's sort of not unlike thinking about how in the United States, I think that we have a sort of self-sufficiency that's probably a consequence of our having also been a colonial nation at one point. So I think there's something to that. Now, how can you prove that? I don't think you really can. But I think there's something to that that's worth thinking about. So let me move here to the next slide. So, for instance, one question we're going to also look at? One thing I want to mention here is what were the first questions in philosophy? And here's a quotation from Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he's discussing the Pre-Socratics. He says, quote, "They do not all agree about how many or what kinds of such principles there are, but Thales, the founder of philosophy, stated it to be water." That's actually Thales' central insight, is that all things are water. And we'll talk about that in the next video in a lot more detail. This is from Aristotle's Metaphysics, 93.9 B18. Notice this is the Becker number. But what I want you to see here is that when Aristotle is referencing Thales, he talks about the idea that Thales and these other pre-Socratic philosophers are looking for principles in nature. So it's a problem about principles in nature. But what does that mean? We're going to see that, and you may have seen this in a previous philosophy class, it's frequently referred to as the problem of the one and the many, right? You'll notice that in our experience, we see things and they all are different things. We see many different things, right? For instance, I've got a coffee cup here. It's got coffee in it. I could have a water in a water cup over here. I've got objects on my desk. Wherever you are at, you also have lots of different things around you. But you can see here, notice that also all things are changing in nature, right? Everything's changing. So my coffee in my coffee cup is slowly getting cold, for instance. I'm slowly getting older, right? Things change. Everything changes, degrades, and atrophies, and new things come and take their place, right? But it's even as simple as, for instance, think about if you're hungry and you eat an apple. Well, when you eat an apple, right? You're taking something that exists as an object and you're eating it, and it's literally giving you nutrition. It's literally becoming part of you. It's changing into you, right? And of course, we sometimes refer to this as the problem of the one and many, because how can it be possible for all of these things to change into other things? So if there's an apple and it's different than me, how is it that when I eat it, somehow it becomes part of me? Even though there may be different things, somehow there must be some central thing that's the same between them. So when you say there's many things, there must be one thing of which they all are. Or in the more, sophisticated way of saying this, is that objects in nature must have some sort of substratum in which they're made of the same stuff. Now, we know today, because of modern physics, we have an explanation. We say, well, everything's made of atoms. Right? That's the one. All things, even though they're many and different, all have one common principle of being atoms, right? Well, the atomic solution actually originates from the Pre-Socratics as well, though not nearly as sophisticated as what you're probably familiar with. But I want you to see here that what this is a problem about, what the Pre-Socratics are beginning to discuss, are problems about principles in nature. They want to know what is a principle. A principle is something like the rule, or it's the structural thing about which something operates. And it looks like in nature there are principles that determine how things work out. And so the pre-Socratic philosophers, they're looking at a whole range of different issues. But one of the issues is just namely, well, what exactly is the world made of? Right? Here I am, an individual in the cosmos. Remember, Thales predicts an eclipse. So imagine looking into the starry heavens and thinking, who am I in this world? What is this universe, this cosmos around which I find myself, right? Or I find myself in the midst of all of these cosmos. What's the nature? What are the principles at the heart of the cosmos? And what's indicative of these first questions in philosophy, we might say these first questions about these first questions about the principles of things, is that they're not religious mythological explanations. So, for instance, contrast mythos. What is mythology? And here I just give you a real brief quote from the Theogony by Hesiod. Now, Hesiod and Homer, if you're not familiar with ancient Greek literature, these are the two primary authors for Greek mythology. Homer is the most famous because of, I would say, because of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but Hesiod is also extremely important in terms of understanding the origination for understanding the origination of the cosmos from the ancient Greek theological perspective. So, for instance, in the Theogony, Hesiod says, "Tell me these things, muses, who dwell on Olympus from the beginning, and tell me which of them was born first." Remember, principles are about things which come first, right? Principles always come first in terms of our understanding of things. And here, Hesiod is asking the muses. Now, the muses, if you'll remember from maybe English literature, these refer to the Greek gods that inspire you, right? They can give you revelation. And here, Hesiod, right, as a Greek bard, as a poet, is asking the gods to give him a revelation about how the world was created and how it came into being. So, for instance, let me read you just a little bit of what Hesiod has to say. Just a little bit here. Pardon me. Right. So he says, "Tell me now, muses, who have dwellings in Olympus, for you are goddesses and present and know everything, while we hear only rumor and we know nothing. Who were the Greek commanders and leaders, the throngs I could never tell nor name? Not even if 10 tongues, 10 mouths belong to me, a voice unbroken, and a bronze heart within me, unless the Olympian muses, daughters of Aegis, holding Zeus, put into my mind those who came below Ilion." So, I'm sorry, that's not Hesiod, that's Homer. This is Hesiod. So both Hesiod and both Homer are appealing to the divine to give them inspiration to know to understand our place in the cosmos, to understand the gods and the goddesses and why we live as we do, and chaos and what death is. All of these central questions that go to the core of what it means to be human, right? These are understood in mythology in the form of narratives. They're religiously inspired authority. So why should you believe the muses? Because they're goddesses, right? And you can see here, though, what's so different about the Pre-Socratics is you see a bold leap into a critical attitude, away from the mythos towards what we might call the logos. And you'll see that Thales, for instance, argued that what is this first principle? It's water. But what's remarkable about Thales is not so much the answer he gives, the idea that the principle is water, but the idea that he gives arguments for it, right? And then Anaximander will say it's the boundless. Anaximenes says it's air. Xenophanes will reject divine authority. And Parmenides will argue that we should trust rational argumentation over our experience of the world, our perception, our natural perception of the world. So these philosophers are leaping past the idea that we should believe things because it's religiously divine and that the gods, and that there's a religious authority. And they say, no, rather we should believe things out of arguments and out of evidence and out of reason. And most importantly, that we don't need a muse. All of us have the capacity to understand arguments and to understand things logically. And so knowledge is actually available to us all. You can see here why I would argue that the ancient Greek world begins with this almost a colonial sense of self-sufficiency. So what were some of the issues that the pre-Socratic philosophers wrote about? They wrote about physics, ethics. They wrote about astronomy, epistemology. They wrote about theology, or gods, the divine. They wrote about mathematics, metaphysics, meteorology, geometry, politics, perception, history, and so on and on. They wrote about a lot of different things. But one of the things we can say is that all of the pre-Socratic philosophers are united by this question of how we ought to live in the cosmos. Number one is, what are the cosmos? What is the nature? And then what does it mean to live in the cosmos? How should we live? And I think this is what sort of binds the pre-Socratic thinkers together in terms of what we're going to take a look at. One thing I'll mention, though, is that the pre-Socratic philosophers, they had to invent this language of philosophy. So we have these nice categories of physics and astronomy and epistemology and metaphysics and so on and so forth. But the pre-Socratic philosophers had none of that. So in many ways, as we begin to read these philosophers, you're going to find that their language, sometimes it seems like they dance around an issue instead of just saying it directly. Part of that's because they don't know how to say it directly. So I encourage you, as you're reading this, to number one, give them a break, in the sense that they're trying to say something for the first time. How does one do that? But also to recognize and to see that we can occupy that sense of wonderment that these philosophers had, and try to understand these issues ourselves for the first time. So as we study the pre-Socratic philosophers, I encourage you to take all of your naturalistic, scientific, modernist explanations and suspend them. Put them on pause and see if you can put yourself in the shoes of these philosophers and just get a sense of the wonderment of the cosmos and how they're trying to articulate these. And I think you'll be able to understand them in a better way. We'll also take a look at, later on briefly, we'll look at the sophist. And the sophist, Protagoras is a famous sophist who argues that man is the measure of all things. And the sophists were traveling teachers who didn't really have answers. They weren't philosophers per se, but they were very important for philosophy because they got philosophers hot and bothered, because they would argue, or some of them, Protagoras in particular, argued that knowledge is actually the invention of the human mind, right? Is that how we understand the world, we are creating these language categories, and how we understand the world is ultimately determined by us. So we can't have knowledge about the way the world is outside of ourselves, because we can't get rid of ourselves. So man is the measure of all things, and knowledge is essentially anthropogenic in its form. And so this bothered the later philosophers of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle quite a bit, because ultimately, if that's the case, if man truly is just the measure of all things, and again, we'll look at this more depth later, it would seem to indicate that that maybe we can never really know the truth about the cosmos. That is, if we define the truth as something that's beyond ourselves. And this is sort of worrisome because it seems to smack of a lack of objectivity. And we can't be objective. Can we really be certain that we're doing the right things in ethics, for instance? Or can we really be certain that our sciences are accurate? And so on and so forth. It reveals a problem about the nature of truth itself. And later philosophers, I don't have a slide for it, we'll look at the Epicureans and the Stoics, but we'll also look at the skeptics. And the skeptics will essentially maintain a philosophic spirit, but recognize that the arguments of the sophist are quite powerful, and maybe we can't be as certain about knowledge as we think. Okay, now what are some of the sources? We're going to be looking at the pre-Socratic philosophers in the next two video lectures here. So where are these sources coming from? As I mentioned, there's no complete pre-Socratic writing. Whoops. There's no complete pre-Socratic... Oh, let me see if I can get back there. Let's see. Oh, sorry about that. There's no complete pre-Socratic writings in existence. So we don't have anything because they were all unfortunately destroyed. So where are we getting this information from? Well, they're called fragments. And the fragments are primarily quotes and citations that are given by later philosophers. Many of you are taking classes in philosophy or in other classes where you have to cite your sources. Well, this is part of the reason why we have this tradition of citing sources, because if they didn't cite these sources, we wouldn't have this information, because we don't have the original books. They're all burned up. What we do have, we have citations. Now, the problem, though, is that a lot of times later philosophers would quote these pre-Socratics in order to argue that the pre-Socratic philosophers were wrong. And so that means that the citations we're given are both incomplete, and for the most part, they probably don't represent fully the actual philosophical ideas of the original philosopher, the way that philosopher would have perhaps presented them. So what we have of them is spotty at best, but we have a long tradition of looking at these, and there's lots of work. And in fact, pre-Socratic studies is a growing field in philosophy today. Now, where are the key authors for the pre-Socratic fragments? Well, here's all the major authors from where these sources come from. You'll see on the left-hand side are all the big name people you probably have heard of: Plato, Aristotle. Theophrastus was actually, he took over Aristotle's school after he died, and then Eudemus, I believe, was also at the same school. We also have Meno, Cicero, the Roman orator, Clement of Alexandria, you've probably heard of the Library of Alexandria, Sextus Empiricus, a doctor from the Roman world. We have Plutarch, of course. And if you're not familiar with these philosophers, I encourage you, for your sense of education, to go take some time, go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, familiarize yourself with who all these people are. We also have a lot of our information from the Pre-Socratics comes from a book called the Placita, or the Opinions, and it was actually based on this work, which is the Attius, which was called Selections in Natural Philosophy. Unfortunately, that book doesn't exist, but the Placita was actually based on it, and so a lot of the fragments come from there. We also have them from Hippolytus, Diogenes, Arterius, Simplicicus, Alexandria, and John Philoponus. Now, I'll say right now, for those of you watching, especially since this is posted on YouTube, that I do not have the authoritative translation pronunciation for these philosophers. In some way, we don't really know how they were pronounced because the actual pronunciation structure of ancient Greek has been lost. We do have a pronunciation structure for it, but most of it's lost. So we don't really know how a lot of this stuff was pronounced, but there are sort of standard ways of pronouncing these guys' names. But I will say right now, just to give myself a way out, I am not that source. If you want to make sure you pronounce these, particularly pronounce them how your professor says them, or how or follow the pronunciation guides in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Anyway, there's lots of different sources. So, but that's where some of our sources about the Pre-Socratics are coming from. So that sort of concludes my brief tour of what we're going to be taking a look at. I know this is our first week, so you're just going to be sort of getting settled in, but I wanted to give you a sense of what we're up to. So take a look at some of these Pre-Socratic philosophers. Next, in our next video, we'll look at their actual philosophical ideas, and we'll look at a lot of the fragments in their concrete particular form. So this concludes the first video for the oh, there's one more thing I do want to mention here, just a final word, which is, it's sort of an introductory point, but please make sure you familiarize yourself with some of the basic categories of philosophy. For instance, I will frequently refer to epistemology. Epistemology refers to your theory of knowledge. I'll refer to metaphysics. Metaphysics, briefly stated, refers to one's theory of reality, or one's transcendental theory of reality. I usually define metaphysics as an investigation into what must necessarily be the case, such that the world is as it is. And then we'll also be taking a look at ethics, which is the question of how one ought to live. I'm not reviewing too much of this. If you're interested in learning more about the basic vocabulary of philosophy, take a look at my YouTube channel, and you can take a look at the video, The Taxonomy of Philosophy, and I sort of break down a lot of these terms in more concrete form. But anyway, that concludes our video for today. Thank you for watching. I'm looking forward to having you in the course, and I think you're going to really enjoy this Pre-Socratic philosophy. Okay, so from mythos to logos, from me to you, thank you very much. I'll see you guys online.